Hey there, weary historian listening in the dead of night. You're no battle-hardened soldier, not some outlaw on the run, not even cursed by cruel fate. Just a simple homesteader with palms roughened by labor and a tin roof secured by sheer determination. You journeyed westward clutching a land deed and a plow, your belly full of ambition. For a while, the dream held. Golden wheat swayed. Neighbors exchanged nods across fence lines. Your children never went to bed hungry. Then the heavens transformed, not with storm clouds, but with a living tempest of wings. Billions upon billions, trillions even. Enough to strip your crops bare, devour your clothing, consume your firewood, and swallow your future down to the last seed. Before the gnawing begins in earnest, before that ceaseless droning hum etches itself into your marrow, do me one small kindness. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what hour it strikes. I always wonder who lies awake bearing witness to these creeping calamities. If you'd like early access to more slow-burning catastrophes like this, ad-free episode audio, or simply wish to support the show, the Patreon link awaits in the description. But for now, settle back, make yourself comfortable. Let's begin properly. You reached the plains clutching a flimsy paper promise and a wagon that groaned louder than your aging joints. That land grant was legitimate enough. Official seal, government stamps, signatures from Washington men who'd never set foot on this soil. You held it like a sacred text, as if parchment could ward off prairie winds. Paper doesn't soften unyielding earth. Doesn't teach you to dig a well in land that hasn't tasted rain in 21 days and scoffs at the notion of mercy. Still you came, dragged your family, your livestock, your tools, and the tattered remnants of your faith in tomorrow across half a continent. When you first scanned that endless flat horizon, you pretended not to notice how it resembled emptiness more than opportunity. That first night roared with absence. No human voices, no music, just ceaseless wind and insects that never learned the meaning of quiet. The children collapsed into a tangled heap of exhausted sleep. Your wife lay staring at the sod house, ceiling you'd barely finished, wondering if the walls would still be standing at dawn. You offered hollow reassurances, not because you believed them, but because admitting uncertainty felt more dangerous than lying. Back east, you'd burned every bridge. There was nothing to return to. No way to confess you'd expected something more. Less dust in your teeth. Less ache in your bones. Morning brought repetition. You worked the fields with your bare hands, sparing the mule's legs from hidden prairie dog holes. The soil, if you could call that ashen clumping soil, resisted the plow. Neighbors nodded in passing when they saw you. No offers of help came, but at least no one spat at your feet, which you took as Midwestern hospitality. One lent you seed grain. Another sold you nails at only mildly predatory prices. You built the fence low and your expectations high, convincing yourself the hardest trials lay behind you. The children grew thin but never complained. They gathered kindling and fetched water without being asked twice. Your eldest learned to set rabbit snares. The youngest stopped asking when supper would be ready. Your wife baked bread from flour tinged with grit and weevils, and you thanked her like it was cake. Sometimes laughter still rang around the hearth on those rare, windless evenings when the sunset painted the wheat gold and the stalks stood tall enough to catch the light. You spoke of harvest yields and next year's planting, of putting up a proper roof before winter returned with teeth bared. Small victories accumulated, a barn that didn't leak, a well that didn't run dry, a row of corn that grew without divine intervention. You wrote your Ohio cousin claiming the land was stern but honest. Didn't mention the blisters weeping into your boots or how your wife sobbed when the last hen got taken by a storm. These weren't lies so much as momentum, because if you stopped to voice the truth, you might never start again. Laundry snapped on the line like gunfire in the constant wind. You mended boots until the soles were more patched than original leather. There was comfort in the rhythm of it all, milking at dawn, feeding the chickens, checking traps, splitting wood, turning soil, begging the earth for forgiveness. Not quite contentment, but something adjacent. Spring arrived hesitantly, like a half-remembered conversation. Snow melted in reluctant streaks, the ground swelling with the memory of moisture. The wheat pushed through in green tendrils that almost looked like pride. You watched its progress with the wary affection of a man who'd lost too much to trust easily. But it grew. Against all odds, it grew. And against your better judgment, you began to believe maybe, just maybe, you'd weathered the worst of it. Evening walks through the fields became ritual, one hand brushing the stalks, listening to their rustling like it carried secret meanings. The air smelled clean. The stars kept their appointments. You'd hold your wife's hand, and neither of you mentioned your splitting boots or throbbing shoulders. The silence between you felt warm rather than heavy. Your daughter presented you with a farm scene drawn in charcoal on sacking cloth, lopsided and crude, but it made your chest ache in the right way. You nailed it to the wall with a bent nail and declared it art. The homestead remained rough-hewn. The roof leaked when rain came sideways. The porch listed like it contemplated abandonment, but it was yours. Every creaking floorboard, every dust-filled rafter, every whiff of wood smoke in your belongings. You'd bled for this. You told yourself the land noticed. That in time, it might learn to love you back. You fell asleep with dirt crammed under your fingernails and every muscle singing from exertion, dreaming of next year's bounty. Enough to trade, to sell, to store. Dreaming of unpatched quilts and boots with intact soles and stew with actual meat. Dreaming of permanence, of becoming the kind of man remembered simply for enduring. But the land doesn't remember. The land doesn't care. And something was already stirring beneath the surface of those dreams. Just beyond sight, just out of reach. Something with wings. Summer announced itself without fanfare. No thunderous arrival. Just a gradual lengthening of days until your morning breath no longer fogged the air. The killing frost retreated into memory, the wind's howl softening into something almost like a lullaby. You woke one morning realizing you'd stopped scanning the sky hourly. The weather, for once, behaved. Fields greened. The sun beat down relentlessly but predictably. You'd learned to worship consistency as its own form of mercy. Your wheat stood tall now. Tall enough to ripple in the breeze like water, tall enough for your children to disappear between the rows and emerge grass-strewn and giggling. Evening walks found you running fingers through the stalks, pretending not to notice how spindly they looked at the base. It's still early. There's time for them to thicken. You've told yourself this twice already today. The neighbors are still around. You see their smoke in the morning, trailing up from chimneys like threadbare flags. You wave across fields. You trade stories and eggs and complaints about the flies. The McKinleys invite you to a picnic near the river. And for the first time in months, your wife doesn't hesitate to say yes. She makes a pie. Your daughter wears her second best dress. The food is simple. The shade is patchy, but no one talks about death or drought or money. That in itself feels like progress. You eat bread made from your own grain. It's a little coarse, a little bitter, but it's yours. It tastes like effort and ash and something almost like pride. You chew slowly. You savor it. Your son asks for seconds, and you give him the last piece without thinking. Your wife smiles without being asked. That night you sleep with the windows open and dream of barrels full of flour stacked so high they scrape the rafters. There's talk of buying more seed, of expanding the fence, of saving for a mule instead of renting one. With interest and apologies. You don't write these things in your ledger, but you mention them aloud, as if saying them might coax them into existence, as if the land might overhear and find your plans charming. You speak of next year the way you once spoke of weddings or babies or spring, not as an uncertainty, but as a given. You're almost reckless with your hope. You write letters to cousins in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and even one in Boston. You haven't seen since childhood. You describe the sky, the harvest, the resilience. You don't mention the debt. You don't describe the cough your wife has had since April. You write words like plenty and promise and bright. You add a line about how the West is hard but fair. You understate because the truth would sound too much like begging. When the rains come, they come gently, a soft patter on the roof, a faint scent of renewal. The fields drink quietly without flooding. The well stays full. You clean the stovepipe. You mend the gate. You count your chickens and find the same number you started with. Even the dog seems less thin. These are the days you'll remember later when the sky turns against you and your memory starts to lie. These are the days that will feel like proof that it wasn't always bad. Your wife plants herbs in an old tin pail. Basil, maybe, or mint, it doesn't matter. She sings while she works, and the tune is unfamiliar, but warm. Your daughter presses flowers between the pages of a Bible no one reads. Your son whittles a toy horse from scrap wood and gives it a name. You watch them from the porch and feel something like contentment take root in your chest. Not deeply, but enough to notice. Enough to miss when it's gone. You till the soil and it smells rich, lo-mai, alive, full of secrets and things that want to grow. You learn the weight of a hoe, the difference between healthy weeds and sick ones. The way your body stiffens differently after 3 hours of shoveling versus 5. You stop checking your reflection. You stop needing one. The dirt under your nails becomes a permanent feature. You start measuring time in calluses. A traveling preacher comes through and holds a service in someone's barn. You attend out of habit, not conviction. He speaks of trials and blessings and the righteousness of endurance. You nod politely, hold your children's hands, and think of the field waiting to be weeded. Faith, you've decided, is better expressed in sweat than in words. You sing the hymns anyway. Your voice doesn't carry, but it doesn't crack either. The mail comes eventually. A newspaper from back east. Headlines about tariffs and railroads, and something called a panic in the banks. You skim it. The words feel far away, muffled by distance and disinterest. You don't need a banker. You need rain. You need time. You need the wheat to hold on just a little longer. You use the newspaper to patch a draft in the wall. Your wife finds a dead bird in the chimney one morning. A starling maybe. Its feathers are scorched, its eyes gone. She buries it in the garden without telling anyone. Later that day, you notice the dog won't go near the stove. You say nothing. It's probably nothing. The evenings grow longer. The air thickens with heat. You chase bugs from the porch, swat at them in your sleep, brush them from the bread before serving it. You make a joke about it. Your wife doesn't laugh, but she does smile. That's enough for now. The horizon is still empty, but it doesn't look threatening anymore. It looks open, possible. The land seems less like an adversary, more like a reluctant partner. You've made peace with its silence, its moods, its cruelty. You believe it's beginning to accept you. You even start to love it a little. The future still feels personal, as if it belongs to you. Or could if you just keep doing what you're doing. If you plan enough, sweat enough, endure enough, the world seems stable, balanced. But somewhere out beyond that horizon, you've stopped fearing. Something stirs. Something old, something hungry. It begins the way most terrible things do, quietly and just a little too early to make sense. You wake before dawn to a stillness that doesn't feel earned. The wind, which usually scratches against the windows and tugs at the eaves, has vanished. The air holds its breath. The dog lifts its head but doesn't bark. Instead, it stares at the door like it's waiting for something that hasn't knocked yet. You listen for the usual morning sounds, chirping, rustling, the slow creak of wood expanding in the heat, but hear nothing. It's not silence, it's a pause, as if the world is deciding whether or not to continue. You step outside expecting mist, or maybe the weight of an early storm. The sky's a dull gray, not the kind that brings rain, but the kind that smothers color. The wheat barely stirs. The horizon is soft, indistinct. You hold your breath without meaning to, waiting for something to happen. Some familiar rhythm to reassert itself. That's when you hear it. Faint at first, a low vibration that you feel in your ribs before it reaches your ears. It hums like a swarm of bees filtered through cloth. Like thunder muffled by a pillow, like wind, but wrong. You tell yourself it's nothing. A dust devil. Maybe a herd moving somewhere in the distance. You don't believe it, but you tell yourself anyway. You look to the animals for guidance. The chickens are silent, not sleeping, rigid. Their heads twitch slightly, side to side, like they're tracking something invisible. The dog whines low in its throat and backs beneath the porch, belly flat to the dirt. You call its name. It doesn't move. You try again, sharper. Still nothing. It's not fear you hear in the dog's voice. It's recognition. The sound grows. It's a hiss now, layered with something else. A rustling, constant, and close like dry paper crumpled again and again in 1,000 hands. Then another sound joins it. Chewing, soft, repetitive, wet. It's the kind of sound you wouldn't notice once, but repeated endlessly, it becomes unbearable. You walk to the edge of the wheat field and look out. At first, nothing. Just a shimmer in the air, then motion. The stalks aren't just swaying. They're moving as if being touched, nibbled, bitten, swallowed. The air begins to change. It smells like grass, but not fresh, bitter, acrid, as if something green has died and begun to ferment in the heat. You take a step back. You hear the chewing more clearly now, layered with a faint clattering, like thousands of tiny wooden beads hitting the ground. You look up. That's when you see it, or rather stop seeing anything at all. The sky is gone, and it's not a metaphor. The sky is physically absent, replaced by a dense, shifting ceiling of wings and legs and bodies. A cloud, but alive. It writhes and pulses in slow, deliberate waves, crawling over itself in every direction at once. Sunlight filters through in patches, casting flickering shadows that ripple across the fields. The wind returns, but it carries a dry, flaking sound with it, like sand being pulled from a great height. You don't move, not because you don't want to, but because your legs forget how something lands on your arm. You swat it away without looking. Another lands on your shoulder, then two, then five. You flinch, try to brush them off, but they are already moving, crawling toward the warmth of your neck, into your collar, beneath your hat. Their feet are sharp. Their wings buzz when trapped. One lands on your lip and begins to crawl downward. You slap your own face harder than you meant to. You run, not far, just to the house. The sound follows you, thickens around you. Inside, the air is worse. Still, stale, filled with dust and the rising stench of panic. Your wife is already at the window, mouth slightly open, face pale. Your daughter stands beside her, frozen, eyes wide and glassy. The boy's under the table, gripping the leg like it will float. You want to say something to reassure, but the words stop somewhere in your throat and dissolve. The first wave hits the house like sleep. A clatter of bodies against walls and shingles. You hear them crawling across the roof, under the eaves, into every crevice they can reach. The walls groan, not from the wind, but from the pressure of wings and weight and hunger. You hear scratching inside the chimney. Something thumps against the window pane and doesn't stop. It's not one thing, it's dozens. You reach for a curtain and find it's already crawling. They get in. Of course they do. Through the cracks in the floorboards, the gap under the door, the vents, the seams between window and frame. No house is sealed well enough to stop hunger. You stamp on them. You swat. You use a broom, a blanket, your own arms. It makes no difference. For everyone you kill, 10 more arrive. They fall from the ceiling like hail. They land in the water bucket. They wriggle into the bread box. Your wife screams once, not a high sound, but a low, short bark of disgust, and then goes silent. You pull her and the children into the root cellar, slamming the door behind you, sealing it with what little you can find. It's dark. The smell of dirt is comforting. You hear them above you, thick against the floorboards, dropping and crawling, a living drumbeat. You wait in the dark with your family, counting the seconds, then losing track of time entirely. You try not to breathe too loudly. Try not to move. Try not to feel the tickle at your ankle that may or may not be real. Eventually, the sound lessens or your mind dulls. You can't tell. You drift in and out of something like sleep. When you emerge hours later or days, the floor is littered with dead things, but not nearly enough of them. The rest are still moving, still chewing, still here. The air is a strange color somewhere between brown and gold, and it's hard to know if it's sunlight or wings causing the shimmer. Your weed is gone, your fence is gone, the clothesline, the laundry, the feed sacks, the rope, even the leather strap from the harness you left outside. You step outside and the land is different. Not burned, not flooded, not torn by war, just eaten, reduced, scraped clean. You've never seen anything devour so quietly, so completely. You realize suddenly that the sound hasn't stopped. It never really stops. You'll hear it in your sleep. You'll hear it in your bones. 1,000 tiny mouths forever chewing. You learn quickly that they don't come just once. The first wave was a shock, something you could almost trick yourself into thinking was a singular event, like a storm or a fire, or the time your cousin's barn was struck by lightning and everything vanished in a moment. But this is different. This isn't a disaster. This is a process. The swarm moves and pulses. You discover this not from books or telegrams, but from the dirt, from the fields, from what's left of the fence post you never got around to replacing. The insects don't arrive, devour, and disappear. They arrive, eat, lay eggs, and leave a promise behind. Not a threat, just biology. A quiet guarantee that this will happen again and soon. You wake to the sound of chewing again. You wake to the sound of silence again. The days blur, and the sky stays the same color too long. They do not travel in a single front. They roll across the land in shifting tides, circling, drifting, returning. It's not just your farm. It's your neighbors. It's the town. It's the riverbed. It's everything flat and growing. Some days the wind feels too still, and you find yourself listening harder than you should. Other days, the sound creeps up behind you, distant at first, then everywhere. You can't tell where they are until they're already in the wheat or what used to be the wheat. You begin to notice what they prefer and what they merely tolerate. They prefer your seed talk, your flour, the pages of your Bible. They tolerate cotton, wool, canvas. They devour the handles of tools, the stuffing from mattresses, the glue from your wife's scrapbook. Your son's wooden toy horse vanishes in the night, splinters scattered like ashes in a shallow dish. You try not to think about it too hard. It was just a toy, but the absence feels sharp. There is no safe season. You had hoped the worst would pass with the heat, but autumn brings no mercy. The eggs they lay, masses of them, clumped like pale beads in the soft dirt, begin to hatch. You don't always see them right away. They move as nymphs first. Small, wingless, hungry. They crawl in lines across the yard, climbing over each other in a ceaseless march. Your daughter says they look like a thought with legs. You're not sure what she means, but she's not wrong. They mole in stages. Every few days, they shed their old skins and leave behind a brittle casing, ghost-shaped and empty. You sweep them out of the pantry. You find them under your bed. You crush them between your fingers without meaning to and can't get the texture off your skin. The smell that follows them is harder to define now. Less grass-like, more fungal, more acid, like mold and heat and hunger boiled together. You read somewhere a long time ago that a single locust can eat its body weight every day. You think of that now as you survey what's left of the field. Multiply that one body by billions, trillions. If the newspapers are right, it becomes abstract very quickly. You stop trying to understand the scale. You focus on what's gone. The bark stripped from the trees, the leather from your boots, the books from the schoolhouse shelf. You focus on the taste in your mouth. Dust mostly with something bitter beneath it. The sun disappears often now, not just from clouds, but from wings. They gather overhead in such numbers that daylight dims like dusk, casting a sickly amber glow over the land. Your wife says the light feels dirty. She's right. It clings to the walls like smoke, thick and dull and full of things you don't want to name. Sometimes the light never fully returns. Not because they're still overhead, but because you've started to see them even when they're not there. You hear reports from other counties, from other states. The papers describe it in numbers. Square miles, bushels lost, tons of feed consumed. They write it as though it's already over, as if it can be summarized. You read the article twice, then use it to patch a broken window pane. The ink smears from the damp. You can't bring yourself to care. The dog returns one day, thinner and quieter than before. It won't enter the house. It stands at the edge of the field and watches the air. You call to it gently. It doesn't move, just stares. Eventually, it walks away again, slow and deliberate, like it's following something you can't see. You don't go after it. You stop sleeping deeply. Every sound wakes you. Wind scratching your own breath. Your dreams are full of wings. Your hands twitch in your sleep, brushing away insects that aren't there. You tell yourself it's just nerves, but you don't believe it. The chewing when it comes feels louder than it should. Not just sound, but sensation. Like your bones are hollow and echoing. You lie still and listen. That's all you can do. They are not clever. They do not think, but they know how to find what they need. Food, shelter, soft things, things that were never meant to resist teeth. You begin to feel less like a person and more like a food source with opinions. The line between survival and existence starts to blur. You do the chores still, such as they are. You sweep the porch even though there's no porch left. You light the stove though there's nothing left to cook. You talk to your children as if nothing is wrong, but they've stopped asking questions. When the sun vanishes behind the wings, you stay indoors. Not because it helps, but because there's nowhere else to go. The walls don't keep them out. They just delay them. The roof sounds like rain again. You sit by the window and watch them crawl across the glass, over each other, toward nothing in particular. They are endless. They are patient. And they are not done. Not yet. Later, someone tries to put a number on it. Several someone's actually experts, men in towns far from here with neat collars and strong opinions. They call it the largest biological swarm in recorded history. They say it stretched across the sky for 1,800 miles, larger than California, wider than Texas. They estimate the number of insects at 30 trillion. You don't have a frame of reference for that. No one does. 30 trillion is a number you can't count toward. A number that stops meaning anything the moment you try to picture it. So you don't try. You just nod when the facts are printed. And you keep your eyes low to the ground. They write it all down. Of course, scientists and newspaper men and men who've never had their seed grains stolen by a cloud with legs. The details get formalized into textbooks and bulletins, copied into lectures, retold in classrooms by people with clean fingernails. They talk about Melanoplus bratus, the Rocky Mountain locust, like it's an idea, a chapter in a natural history book. They say it weighed hundreds of millions of tons, that the sheer mass of them bent railroad tracks under their collective pressure. They say that when they passed overhead, they left behind a sky that took hours to clear. You read those words once years later and find them correct, but insufficient. You don't need the statistics. You were there. You remember what it looked like, what it felt like. You didn't see a number. You saw everything vanish at once. The swarm didn't look like movement. It looked like atmosphere, like the world had forgotten how to hold itself together. You could watch a tree disappear branch by branch, as if some invisible hand was sketching it out in reverse. You could watch your own front step dissolve beneath 100 mouths that didn't understand the difference between food and foundation. The air wasn't empty between locusts. It was just full of smaller ones, younger ones, translucent and vibrating, already learning how to eat before they could land. You began to think of them less as animals and more as an event like drought or famine or war. They were a phenomenon, not a creature. You couldn't kill them. You couldn't trap them. You couldn't run from them. You could only measure the damage after they left and hope you were still standing. They moved like fog, low and dense and faster than you thought possible. Not chaotic, not aimless, just everywhere. They poured over fences and roofs and rivers like water with legs. You saw them fall into the well and not drown. They floated on top of the bucket, still moving. You saw them cover a pig alive. When you reached it later, only bone and hoof remained. You buried what was left, not out of respect, but because the smell made the children gag. You tried to estimate how long the swarm lasted, but time became strange while it happened. It could have been an hour or a week. The sun came up and went down. You lit candles. You forgot to eat. The dog wouldn't come near the house. The chicken stopped laying, then stopped moving. The sky was always the same, thick, brown, buzzing. He thought about going to town once, just to see if anyone else had made it through. But the roads were gone. Not destroyed, just erased, replaced by a soft, shifting crust of wings and carcasses and damp chewed vegetation. You could feel it give under your boots. You heard stories later when people were talking again. A girl up north had her dress eaten while she was wearing it. A man tried to light a field of them on fire and burn down his barn instead. One farmer loaded his family into a wagon and drove south until the wheels fell off. He kept walking. No one ever saw him again. There were tales of women shaking locusts from their bed linens in the morning only to find them crawling out of the feather pillows, of crops eaten to the roots, seed and all, of wood piles that vanished, of outhouses chewed through, of Bibles hollowed to their bindings. You saw a cow go mad from the bites. You saw your wife pluck one from her soup and keep eating. You said nothing. What else was there to say? Some evenings you go outside and find them all still like statues hanging from branches clinging to fences embedded in cracks in the wall, silent, waiting, their wings twitching just slightly like dreams under thin skin. You couldn't tell if they were asleep or just thinking. Sometimes you'd step on one and hear the pop of its body giving way under your heel. You didn't stop to look. The next day they would be gone. Not all of them, never all, but enough that you could see the sun again. Enough to imagine maybe it was over. But even when they left, they didn't leave nothing. They left a coating of filth across every surface, fragments, wings, crushed shells, droppings. The smell took weeks to fade. You washed your hands until your knuckles bled, and you still felt them on your skin. You looked across the field and saw only stubble. What hadn't been eaten had been trampled. What hadn't been trampled had withered from being shaded too long. The plants hadn't just been attacked. They'd been erased. There wasn't enough left to compost. The barn was missing slats. The porch had no railing. The pantry door hung by one hinge. You stood there in the aftermath, surrounded by your possessions, and realized most of what you owned was now part of their bodies, carried off, digested, transformed into the next wave. That's what haunted you in the quiet moments. Not just what was gone, but what it had become. Your harvest, your shirts, your bed linens, they hadn't vanished. They had joined the swarm. You breathed in their remnants with every gust of wind. They filled the cracks in the house, the folds in your clothes, the lungs of your animals. You scraped their wings from the rim of the soup pot. You wiped their waste from your child's pillow. They were everywhere still. Even when the sky was clear, even when the numbers stopped, even when the paper said it was over, it's not just what's gone that disturbs you. It's what was supposed to come next. The swarm didn't just consume the present. It erased the future. Not loudly, not all at once, but piece by piece with a slow certainty that leaves no room for rebuilding. You go to the shed where you kept the seed sacks for spring. The good sacks you stitched yourself from flour bags and twine, and find them gnawed open, their contents scattered and useless. Not just eaten, pulverized. The seeds are there technically, but they're broken, hollowed out, chewed through, and spat aside like shells. You pick one up and press it between your fingers. It crumbles. You do this again and again until your palm is coated in dust and what's left of your fingernails. You don't speak. There's nothing to say. You'd plan next year around these seeds, the spacing, the rotation, the storage. You'd drawn diagrams in the margin of your notebook, lined out each row by hand. Now you stare at that same notebook and realize the swarm found it too. The corners are curled, the binding gnawed. Whole pages are missing. The rest are brittle and pocked with holes like some disease ran through them. Inside the house, the damage is quieter, but no less thorough. You find the rafters stripped where the insects managed to squeeze through. Not all of them, just enough. They chewed grooves into the edges, scraped away the finish, left trails of sawdust that your daughter swept into a pile without asking what it was. Your wife holds up a curtain rod and shows you the teeth marks. They're precise, patterned, like wood was no different from wheat. Your Bible is gone in all the ways that matter. The leather cover was the first to go, eaten clean off in one night. The stitching unraveled. The pages, what's left of them, are translucent and curling at the edges, their words disrupted by tiny holes like lace made by tiny teeth. The story of Job is unreadable now. You joke that maybe it's better that way. Your wife doesn't answer. She just closes the book slowly and places it back on the shelf like it might still be useful for something. Maybe to keep the shelf from looking too bare. You try to laugh, not because it's funny, but because the alternative feels dangerous. It comes out wrong, tight, and bitter. Your daughter looks up at you with something like confusion or maybe just fatigue. Your son doesn't look up at all. Your wife starts to sweep the floor again, even though it's clean, or at least clean enough. The bristles scrape over the wood and kick up dust, and she keeps going, one section at a time, as if this is still a house worth keeping. Your youngest won't stop scratching. She says nothing about it, doesn't whine or cry, just keeps rubbing at her arms, her legs, her neck. You check for bites, rashes, hives, anything. There's nothing visible, but the itch is real. You know, because you feel it, too. All of you do. It's under the skin, not on it. A memory of crawling things, a phantom sensation left behind by something that was never meant to touch you. You soak her in a tin bath and scrub her skin gently with lye soap. She sits still as a statue. When you finish, she gets out, dries off, and begins scratching again before she's even dressed. You open your chest of tools and find the contents chewed at the handles. The wooden grips are splintered, soft, pitted with tiny grooves. You pick up a hammer and realize it no longer fits comfortably in your hand. The balance is off. You turn to the saw and see that the blade is fine, but the handle flakes at your touch. The workbench itself is littered with wings. Not full bodies, just wings, pale and translucent and scattered like petals from a dying bloom. You walk out to the barn, though there's not much reason to anymore. The goats are gone, traded before the worst of it for flour that didn't last. The plow is still there, rusting gently under the eaves. The harness is stripped of padding. The tack has been hollowed out. The saddle you inherited from your father is missing one stirrup and the entire underside of the seat. When you lift it, a piece crumbles in your hands. You carry it outside and set it down gently beside the compost heap, like something you've buried before. Your neighbor stops by, the one from 3 miles down the road. He doesn't come to talk. He just stands near the fence, the part of it still standing, and looks at you like he's trying to decide whether to ask a question. Eventually, he mutters something about leaving, about packing up, maybe heading east again. You nod. He doesn't ask if you're coming. He doesn't need to. You both already know the answer. When he leaves, you watch the road for a long time, even after he's disappeared. You check your stores again, not because anything's changed, but because habit is stronger than hope. The root cellar is mostly empty now. Some jars of pickled beans, one sack of flour with holes in the corners, a few potatoes that are more bruised than food. The apples rotted weeks ago. You left them too long, not out of carelessness, but denial. You stare at the shelf and try to remember how much a man needs to survive a winter. You can't come up with a number. Your wife begins sewing scraps of cloth together, not for warmth, but for repair. Curtains, shirts, a shawl that's more whole than fabric. The cloth you saved for your daughter's birthday dress is missing. You find it later, half eaten under the bed. You pick it up and carry it to your wife, unsure why. She takes it from your hand, folds it carefully, and places it in the mending basket without saying a word. At night, you sit near the hearth and stare into the ashes, though the fire hasn't been lit in days. You think about the seed again, about how much you would have planted, about how it would have looked in spring, rows and rows of something that could have mattered. You think about the holes in the roof, the hollow Bible. You think about what they took and how what they left isn't yours anymore. They didn't just eat the harvest. They ate the map, the blueprint, the plan. They took the next step and the one after that. They devoured what hadn't happened yet. And now there's nothing left to wait for. At first, it's just hunger, an inconvenience, a tightness behind the ribs, a bit of dizziness when you stand too quickly. You tell yourself it's manageable. You drink water instead of eating, chew slowly, serve smaller portions. You ration without calling it that. The body adapts. You've heard. You say this to your wife one evening while dividing a heel of bread 4 ways. She nods, doesn't answer, chews with her mouth closed slowly, carefully like she's afraid of waking something. Then the quiet begins. It sneaks in when you're not paying attention. The children stop asking when supper will be ready. They stop fighting over who gets the bigger half. They sit still longer, speak less, blink more slowly. Your son once tripped over the water bucket and laughed until he cried. Now he avoids the bucket entirely, as if afraid he'll use energy he can't afford to replace. Your daughter chews on the corner of her sleeve until it frays. She tells you it helps. You let her. You boil a belt one night. Not the good one. Just a cracked old strap from the harness. Thick and useless otherwise. You scrub it first. You slice it into strips. You boil it with salt and a few leftover herbs. It smells wrong, like smoke and barn dust and desperation. Your wife pretends to eat it. The children nibble and grimace. You chew until your jaw hurts, then swallow a piece so you can tell yourself you did. You scrape the inside of flour sacks with the back of a spoon. The scraps are gray and coarse, stuck in the weave of the cloth. You add water and stir. It doesn't thicken. It doesn't matter. It becomes paste. You eat it anyway. Your wife finds the last root in the bin and cuts it into 4 pieces. Even though it's shriveled and soft, and the inside is more black than white. No one complains. Your son says, "Thank you." You think about crying, but don't. It's not worth the water. One night, your son chases a rat across the barn floor. He doesn't catch it, but he tries. You don't stop him. You even help him seal the holes where it got away. Not to keep it out, but to keep it in. Your wife hears and says nothing. Your daughter watches him sharpen a stick with a knife that barely has a handle left. The next morning, he sets a trap. You ask what he'll do if he catches it. He shrugs. "Eat it," he says. You don't laugh. You just nod. Your daughter gnaws on a pencil stub. She doesn't write with it, just holds it in her mouth while she stares out the window. Her cheeks are hollow now. Her wrists look like they belong to someone smaller. You ask her what she's thinking about, and she tells you very calmly, "Butter." You try to smile. It feels like someone else's face. You find a bit of chalk in the drawer, left over from when your wife used to mark preserves on the cellar wall. It's old, soft, slightly damp. You pretend it's medicine. Your daughter pretends, too. She sucks on it like a lozenge, slowly, reverently, as if it will make her throat forget the emptiness beneath it. Your wife watches, but says nothing. Later, you catch her doing the same. You go into the yard one morning and find a potato in the mud, small, half crushed, already green at the edges. You fall to your knees without realizing it. You dig it up like treasure, like something buried with love. When you pick it up, you see the bite marks. Something else found it first, but the teeth didn't get far. You carry it inside anyway. That night, you cut the good half into thin slices, fry them in nothing at all, and share them like communion. You dream of food often now. Not feasts, just normal meals. Soup with salt, bread with crust, an apple you didn't have to trade for. You dream of fat, of cheese, of warmth in your belly. In your dreams, you chew without pain. You swallow without guilt. You wake up each time with your mouth dry and your heart racing. Your wife holds you some nights when the shivering won't stop. You used to think it was the cold. Now you know better. The body starts to change. Your clothes grow loose. Your skin grays. Your thoughts come slower. You forget what day it is. You forget what you were saying halfway through the sentence. You try to help your wife with chores and find yourself sitting in the dirt without remembering how you got there. You carry wood until you drop it. You fall asleep sitting up. You tell yourself it's fine. The body adapts. The baby cries less now. You try not to think about what that means. You find yourself counting the remaining nails in the jar, not because you need them, but because it gives your hands something to do. You sharpen tools that won't be used again. You sweep the floor, though there's nothing left to track in. You stir water like it might become stew. You write a list of things you'd eat if you had them. You leave it on the table, hoping someone else will add to it. Your wife offers to go to town. It's far, too far. You tell her no. She offers again the next day. You argue. She cries. That night, she lays beside you and traces your spine with one finger. You don't speak. There's nothing left to argue about. The silence thickens. The house stops feeling like shelter. The bed stops feeling like rest. The cellar stops feeling like storage. Every object you own becomes something you could burn or break or chew. You look at the bookshelf and wonder if paper burns hotter than cloth. You look at the curtains and think about soup. You look at your own hands and stop thinking altogether. Starvation is not what you thought it would be. It isn't rage. It isn't violence. It isn't a scream. It's a hush, a slowness, a folding inward. It's the moment when your child says, "I'm not hungry," and means it. It's when your wife forgets the word for ladle. It's when you find a beetle crawling on the windowsill and consider letting it live just to see if it might lead you to more. You sit on the floor and listen to the wind, though you know it won't bring anything good. You listen for the chewing again. You almost miss it. Not because you want them back, but because at least when they were here, there was still something to lose. Now there's only waiting. Eventually, someone remembers you exist. Not a neighbor, not a friend. A government official, maybe a Claire in an office hundreds of miles away who saw a number on a list and filed it under distress. Somewhere in Washington or Topeka, Your suffering became a category, a statistic, a line in a report that someone initialed. And so, as a result, something is done, or at least planned. Food is allocated, supplies are gathered, provisions are loaded into wagons, men are given instructions. Word spreads slowly, but it spreads. There's to be a shipment. Flour mostly. Maybe some beans. Maybe salt pork if you're lucky. The army is sending it. Not much, but something. Relief. You hear the word and don't know what to do with it. It's too large, too late, too abstract. You repeat it to your wife that evening softly, like it might spook if said too loud. She nods, but doesn't look up from the stitching in her lap. You wait. Of course you wait. There's nothing else to do. The work has shrunk to match your strength. The chores are fewer now because there is less to maintain, less to protect. The fence is falling. The barn leans. You wait on the porch on a chair that cacks under your shrinking weight and stare down the road that hasn't seen a wagon in weeks. You listen for wheels, for voices, for anything that might resemble mercy in motion. What comes first is a letter folded, stamped, delivered by a passing rider who doesn't stop. He tosses it into the dust near your gate and moves on without looking back. You pick it up carefully, as if it might bruise. The paper is soft from humidity. The ink slightly smeared. It says relief coming. Just that. No date, no list, no signature. You carry it inside and lay it on the table. No one touches it again. 2 days later, the letter is missing. You find it covering the cracked window pane near the bed, taped up to block a draft. Your wife doesn't mention it. Neither do you. The wagon never arrives. You hear it got stuck 2 towns over, or it broke an axle, or the driver got sick, or there were too many people and not enough sacks to go around. The details vary depending on who's telling it, but the conclusion remains the same. The food is gone or elsewhere or delayed indefinitely. You nod when you hear this, as if it confirms something you already suspected. Hope, after all, is heavier than hunger. You can only carry so much. Another family down the road decides to walk. They heard the food was being given out near the river town, the one with the big church and the grain mill. It's far. 3 days on foot if you're strong, 5 if you're not. They leave with blankets and a kettle tied to a cart. The children ride inside wrapped in wool. The father waves once half-heartedly, as if unsure whether he means goodbye or good luck. You watch them go. You never see them again. You consider following. You even begin to pack. A bundle of shirts, a tin cup, the last bit of lard wrapped in paper. But your wife doesn't move. She looks at the sky and says nothing. Your son asks how long the walk would take. Your daughter doesn't ask anything at all. You repack the shirts quietly and put the lard back in the cupboard. You sit down at the table and trace circles into the wood with your finger. Days pass, then more. The food doesn't come. Another letter does. It's addressed to residents of affected counties. It outlines available resources, advises calm, suggests patience. You burn it without reading the second half. At some point, someone from the next farm over passes by. He's thinner than last time. His boots are cracked. He says there's flour in the next county, but only for registered claimants. You ask what that means. He shrugs. He says something about paperwork, about names on lists. You haven't seen a list. You haven't written your name down in months. You thank him anyway and give him a crust of bread. He pockets it and walks away slowly. Head down. You think he might be crying. You don't ask. You begin to ration air. That's what it feels like. You eat less than the day before, not because it helps, but because you've stopped believing help is coming. Your wife boils water for meals that never happen. Your children sleep more often than they should. You catch yourself watching their chests rise and fall, counting breaths like it's a job. You write a note to yourself that says, "Don't forget to breathe." You forget where you put it. You dream of bread. Not good bread, just enough of it. You wake with your mouth dry and your hands twitching toward the shelf where the flour used to be. You stare at your own hands and wonder how much more they'll shrink before they stop being useful. You fold them together, then apart, then together again. One morning, you open the door and find a sack sitting on the porch. It's small, tied with rough twine. You bring it inside and open it slowly, like it might disappear if handled too quickly. It's flour. Coarse, yellowed, bitter smelling, but it's flour. There's no note, No name, no explanation. You don't ask where it came from. You don't care. That night, your wife bakes something like biscuits. You eat them in silence. Your daughter cries while chewing. Your son thanks the wall. You all go to bed with something in your stomach. It doesn't help as much as you thought it would. The next morning, the sack is gone. You don't remember using it all, but you must have, or it never had much to begin with. You think about the word relief again and find it strange. It sounds like it should mean breathing easier, lighter shoulders, a loosening, but nothing about this feels light. It feels like waiting for the next blow. You keep watching the road. You don't expect anything, but you keep watching just in case someone else forgot you still exist. The McKinleys were the first to go, not without warning, but without ceremony. You saw the wagon hitched to their last surviving mule. The trunks lashed down with rope that used to hold their barn door shut. The children looked smaller than you remembered. The mother had her arms wrapped in layers of curtain and tablecloth, whatever fabric was left. She waved or tried to. Her fingers barely moved. Mr. McKinley didn't speak, just nodded once in your direction and looked down the road like he was trying to memorize it. You watched them disappear into the tree inn and told yourself they'd make it to town, that they'd find what they needed, that they'd survive. You've told yourself the same thing every day since. And it still doesn't sound like a lie. Not quite. The Jamesons lasted longer. They had more animals at first, a better well. They shared their lard with you last winter when yours turned rancid in the cellar. You returned the favor with flour or what passed for it. The trade felt honest, mutual. You hadn't seen them in days when their oldest came running barefoot down the road. His voice was, his eyes wild. Your wife ran to meet him. He collapsed at the fence. You carried him inside, sat him down, poured what little water you had into a chipped cup. He drank like he'd forgotten how. He didn't ask for details, but he gave them anyway. The younger children had taken ill. One stopped waking up. Another stopped walking. They buried the third before dawn. He said it flatly like he was reciting from a list. He didn't cry. He didn't look at anyone while he spoke. You asked if he was staying. He shook his head. Just wanted to rest. You let him sleep in the barn. Covered him with 2 wool blankets and your own coat. By morning he was gone. The settlement quiets the way a fire dies. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just less and less light until only smoke remains. You stop hearing dogs bark. You stop seeing laundry flapping on lines. You stop hearing arguments or greetings or children. The mail hasn't come in weeks, but even when it did, no one opened their letters in public anymore. You used to nod to every passing face. Now you look away, unsure if there's anything left to say. You light fewer candles now, not just to save wax, but because darkness feels safer. The windows don't reflect as much. The night doesn't judge. The wick flickers low and you let it, watching the shadow of your hand stretch across the table. You used to keep the fire going until everyone was asleep. Now the hearth stays cold. You tell the children it's for the best. You say you're conserving fuel. You say it with a straight face and they believe you. You dream of soup. Thick, hot, savory. Your mother's soup. Maybe, though you can't remember what was in it. Potatoes, probably. Parsley, something fatty. You wake up licking your lips and hate yourself for it. Your daughter dreamed of cake the other night. She described it in vivid detail. Layers, icing, the candied flour on top. She was smiling when she spoke, which somehow made it worse. You told her it sounded lovely. You didn't tell her you forgot what sugar tastes like. One day, a stranger comes. You don't hear him arrive. He's just suddenly there standing at the edge of your yard like he grew out of the dust. He's not old, but his clothes are worn thin at the elbows, dark with sweat, legs wrapped in cloth to keep his boots from falling apart. He doesn't smile, doesn't threaten, just asks if you have a stockpile, says it plain like a man asking for directions. You lie, not because you want to, but because you have to. You say no. Say you're barely hanging on. Say you've got a few jars left. Nothing worth trading. He nods slowly like he expected the answer. He thanks you, then stands there for another moment watching the house, watching the children through the window. You feel your hand tighten around the broom handle even though he hasn't moved. Eventually he turns and walks away. You watch until he vanishes behind the hill. You never see him again. You wonder how many doors he knocked on. You wonder if anyone said yes. The silence after is worse than before. You start hearing things that aren't there. A creak on the porch. A knock on the wall. The wind moves through the trees like someone sighing. Your wife jumps when the roof groans. Your son keeps the kitchen knife near his bed. You pretend not to notice. You all sleep lighter now, or not at all. The house becomes smaller somehow. You don't move less, but there's less to move around. The rooms feel full of air and nothing else. You shift chairs without reason. Rearrange the pantry shelves that hold almost nothing. Your wife folds blankets you haven't used. She lines up jars by size. It gives her something to do. The children count the remaining matches. They argue about whether it's 22 or 23. You say nothing. You know it's 19. You think about the McKinleys, about the Jamesons, about the stranger, about the family from down the road that just stopped lighting lamps one night and was never seen again. You wonder how many are still out there behind shuttered windows and sealed doors, doing exactly what you're doing. Waiting for something or someone or nothing at all. You wonder if the silence is happening everywhere or just here. Your wife begins talking to herself in the evenings, quietly under her breath while stirring water or folding rags. The words don't make sense. Bits of hymns, names of relatives long dead. Her voice doesn't sound distressed, just absent. She doesn't seem to notice. You do, but you don't interrupt. Your daughter collects feathers now. She says they're lucky. She lines them up in a row beneath the window, sorted by size and color. Some are from chickens, some from birds long gone. One is from a pillow that split open last month. She doesn't care. She says they're all the same once they fall. Sometimes you sit on the porch and count how many homes still have smoke rising from their chimneys. You used to count 10, then 6, now maybe 3. Or maybe that one on the ridge is just a trick of the light. You can't be sure anymore. You lose track mid-count. You forget what number you started on. The silence isn't peaceful. It's weight. It sits on your shoulders, fills your ears, settles in your mouth like dust. You want someone to speak, but you don't want to be the one to start. You want someone to arrive, but you don't want to answer the door. You want someone to help, but you've forgotten what that looks like. So, you light one more candle than usual just for the warmth. You tell yourself it's because the nights are getting colder. You tell yourself a lot of things. Some of them are even true. You change. You don't notice it at first. How could you? Change like this doesn't come with warnings. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or thunder. It comes quietly in the space between chores, in the stillness between breaths. You wake one morning and your hands are cracked again. Not just dry, split, thin, sharp lines that sting when you reach into the water bucket. You wrap them in cloth as you always do. You used to use salve. You change. You don't notice it at first. How could you? Change like this doesn't come with warnings. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or thunder. It comes quietly in the space between chores, in the stillness between breaths. You wake one morning and your hands are cracked again. Not just dry, split, thin, sharp lines that sting when you reach into the water bucket. You wrap them in cloth as you always do. You used to use salve. Now you just tie the rags tighter. Your thoughts come slower. Names slip away and have to be retrieved like tools misplaced in tall grass. You start sentences that don't end. You ask questions you've already answered. You forget where you put the shovel only to find it still in your hand. You stare out the window without realizing you've stopped moving. When your wife speaks to you, you have to blink before you hear her. She speaks less now anyway. Her voice is still soft, but rarer. She hums sometimes when she stirs the pot or folds a blanket, but the words are gone. When she does speak, it's practical. 2-word sentences. Water's low. Stove's cold. He's sleeping. You nod. She nods. You used to sit together on the porch and talk about what to plant next year. Now you sit there in silence. Not because you've run out of things to say, but because saying them feels like work. The children have stopped playing. Not out of punishment, not out of illness, just out of stillness. They sit near the hearth and stack things. Buttons, stones, bits of broken pottery. They count them, line them up, rearrange them. You used to call that playing once. Now it looks like waiting. When your son speaks, it's in facts. We have 7 matches. We have 5 potatoes. We have 2 candles left. You nod, then forget the numbers. You still do the chores, not because they need doing, but because they fill the time. You fetch water from the well, even though no one drinks more than a few sips a day. You split kindling, though the fire stays cold. You milk the cow that isn't there anymore. She was traded for supplies last month, or maybe the month before. You stand in the barn at dawn and stare at the empty stall, hands still at your sides, as if she might step in on her own. You hear her breathing sometimes. You know she's not there. You sweep dust off dust. You tidy corners that haven't changed in weeks. You sharpen tools you no longer use. You check the shed for pests, even though the pests have long since moved on to richer places. You close the gate that hangs by one hinge. You tap the roof with the broom handle to check for leaks, though the rain hasn't come in days. It feels like pretending, but not in a cruel way. More like remembering. A soft rehearsal of a life that used to make sense. Your skin changes, dry, papery, spotted. Your fingernails grow strange, thicker in some places, cracked in others. Your joints ache when you stand, and the ache doesn't fade when you sit. Your back bends more than it used to. You notice it when you look at your reflection in the wash basin and realize your shoulders curve forward like a man bracing against something. You're not sure what. When maybe your memory. You wait for spring like it owes you something, an apology at the very least. You check the trees daily, looking for the smallest sign of green, a bud, a shoot, a hint of softness in the branches, but they stay brittle. The grass does not return. The earth still crunches when you walk on it. You kneel in the garden bed and dig with your fingers just to feel something living. You find only grubs and a single rotting beet. You replant the beet out of habit. Your wife finds you outside one night barefoot in the dirt, staring at the empty rows. You don't remember walking out there. She doesn't ask. She just guides you back inside, wipes your feet with a damp cloth, and tucks the blanket tighter around your legs than usual. You try to thank her, but your tongue feels too large. She nods anyway, as if she's heard it. You begin speaking to things, not always out loud, sometimes in your head. You speak to the floorboard that creaks, to the shutter that bangs in the wind, to the spoon in the pot. Not full conversations, just fragments, little acknowledgments. You start saying good morning to the kettle, good night to the empty coop. You call the stove old girl when it won't light. You don't notice the habit until your son starts doing it, too. The calendar on the wall is 2 months behind. You've stopped crossing off the days. No one knows what day it is, and it doesn't seem to matter. You eat when there's food. You sleep when it gets dark. The concept of a schedule feels laughable now. The sun is your only clock. The hunger is your only appointment. You forget your age. You try to remember it one evening, counting backward from what you think was your birth year, and come up with 3 different numbers. You settle on the lowest one. It feels more honest. You forget the birthdays of your children, though you remember the days they were born. You forget the name of the family who used to live near the creek. You forget what the creek looks like. You find yourself walking more. Not far, just loops around the house, once around the barn, down to the gate, then back again. Your son follows you sometimes. Your daughter watches from the window. You're not sure if it's exercise or ritual. You think maybe it's both. You don't feel panic anymore. Not dread, not grief, not fear, just a kind of thinning, like you're being erased in layers. The edges first, then the details, then the name. You still answer to it, but it feels borrowed, like a coat someone left behind. Spring will come. Of course it will. It always does. You tell yourself this every morning, and it doesn't sound false. It just sounds tired. When it does arrive, if it arrives, you'll be here to greet it. Bent, quieter, but here. And maybe that's enough. Or maybe it isn't. The textbooks call it the Rocky Mountain Locust Swarm. Some refer to it as the Locust Plague of 1875. You've seen the dates printed neatly in black ink, May to July, with variations depending on the region. They include maps shaded in red and brown, color-coded to show the areas of worst devastation. They calculate the weight of the swarm in tons. They compare the size to the state of California. They list casualty estimates mostly in crops, sometimes in coin, rarely in people. They mention that 30 trillion insects darken the sky. They mention that they were never seen again after the turn of the century. They call it a marvel of entomology, a historical curiosity, a footnote. They don't mention your wife's hands. The way the skin split open across her knuckles when she tried to pull boards over the windows. The way her fingers stiffened from cold and exhaustion. The way her nails stayed dark for months from scrubbing floors that no longer needed scrubbing. They don't record how she stopped brushing her hair, how she hummed to herself long after she stopped cooking just to make the house feel less empty. They don't mention the way your son stopped speaking. Not all at once, not dramatically, just fewer words each day until there was nothing left. At first he answered in nods, then only with his eyes, then not at all. You kept asking him questions long after he lost the will to respond, hoping your voice would tether him to something. It didn't. He just sat near the window with a rock in his hand and carved little circles into the wood. The textbooks don't mention that either. They don't say how silence can be louder than panic. There's no entry in any historical record for what it smells like when everything you've built turns to insect dung and wind. They don't catalog the stench left behind by billions of dying bodies or the sweet rotting odor that clings to linens and skin. There's no mention of the way the air thickens inside the house, even with the door open. No notation for the smell of boiled leather and wet rope when you've run out of food and still need to chew something. They don't describe the smell of your daughter's hair after weeks without soap. They don't talk about the bitter edge that never leaves your mouth, even after you've brushed your teeth with ash. The historians quote letters from land agents, newspaper clippings, accounts from traveling preachers. They don't quote your wife when she stood at the stove and said, "I think I'm forgetting how to want things." They don't mention what it looks like when a mother feeds her children first and then stares at an empty pot without blinking. They don't mention what it does to a man to watch his family lose weight in places they shouldn't, to watch movement become effort, to watch joy become memory. They mention the economic damage, but not the moral damage. Not the way your neighbors stopped speaking to each other before they left. Not the way doors stayed shut, even when someone knocked. They don't note the look in a man's eyes when he sees you notice how empty his cart is. They don't say how many people stole from each other. Not out of greed, but because there was nothing else. They don't count the theft of small things like soap or buttons or trust. They don't mention your wife's Bible, how it was gnawed to ruin, how she kept it anyway out of habit or reverence, or just because it used to be something solid. They don't mention how she tried to read it aloud long after the words had become holes. They don't mention how your daughter used one of the pages to catch a dying fly because she wanted to bury something that day. They mention loss of livestock, but not how it feels to trade your last goat for a single sack of cornmeal and then watch the sack leak all the way home. They don't mention the moment when your daughter asks if you'll ever have a cow again, and you can't remember the word for maybe. They don't mention what you tell your wife when she asks what you'll do if the crop doesn't come in this time. You don't remember what you said, but you remember the look in her eyes after you said it. They mention adverse psychological effects, but not the moment you realized you were talking to the empty barn as if it could hear you. They don't talk about the time your wife tucked in an invisible child because it felt wrong to leave the bed empty. They don't talk about the stranger who came by looking for food and how you lied without guilt. They don't say how you stood by the window that night with a hammer in your hand and waited for nothing in particular. They don't mention the sound of chewing. Not the first time, not the last, not the way it lingers after the insects are gone, not the way you still hear it in your sleep. Soft and rhythmic like a thing that never learned how to die. They don't describe how silence now feels louder than noise used to, or how wind brushing the roof still makes your skin twitch. They don't talk about how long it took before you laughed again, or if you did. They don't talk about the difference between surviving and living. They don't ask whether you ever looked at a handful of dirt again without imagining it moving. They don't ask if your children ever regained their appetite for anything more than bread and silence. They call it a plague. They call it a swarm. They call it the worst of its kind. But they don't call it personal. They don't call it intimate. They don't call it a thing that climbed inside your skin and stayed there long after the skies cleared. They don't say how it followed you, how it still follows you, how you never really stepped out from beneath its shadow. What they write is true, but what they leave out is what mattered. And what they leave out is what you still carry. You outlast the swarm barely. That matters. Technically, the insects leave eventually. The sky becomes just sky again. Blue on some days, gray on others, empty most of the time. You wake up one morning and realize the chewing has stopped. There's a quiet you don't trust. At first, you lie still and listen for the sound you've been bracing against for months. It doesn't come. That's supposed to feel like relief, but it doesn't. It feels like something waiting to be replaced. The children survive mostly. Your son eats again, though slowly, and still doesn't say much. Your daughter smiles sometimes, but not with her whole face. You've learned not to expect recovery to look like it did in stories. There's no celebratory meal, no triumphant return to routine. They just get a little taller, a little thinner, a little quieter. They begin to ask fewer questions and do more work. That's supposed to be maturity. You try not to think about what else it could be. You rebuild in a manner of speaking. The fence is patched with twine and salvaged boards. The barn has new beams, lighter, cheaper, slightly crooked. The house still leans, but the roof holds mostly. You dig up the field again, though your back protests the efforts. You plant seeds that may or may not be viable. You rake the rows straighter this time, as if neatness might improve your odds. You tell yourself it's possible. The land grant is still nailed to the wall, though the edges are curling now. The ink is fading, and the name, your name, looks unfamiliar when you read it. You signed it with pride once. Now you stare at it like it belongs to someone else. The promise was clear. Land of your own, freedom, prosperity, if you worked hard enough. And you did. You worked until your hands bled, and your knees stiffened, and your hearing turned inward. And still you were eaten. You understand now that promises are not guarantees. That the land doesn't owe you kindness just because you arrived with good intentions. You brought hope, yes, but so did everyone else. It didn't make the soil softer. It didn't stop the sky from going dark. It didn't keep the insects from finding your roof, your clothes, your pantry, your skin. Hope didn't protect your family. Work didn't save your neighbors. Faith didn't feed your children. You don't say these things out loud, but you feel them settle deeper each day. You think sometimes about those who left, the McKinleys, the Jamesons, the stranger who knocked and then vanished. You wonder if they found something better or if they were simply erased somewhere else. You picture them walking, always walking, chasing rumors of help, arriving too late to each one. You don't envy them, but you don't pity them either. You all made the same choice in different directions. You start measuring time in new ways, not by seasons, but by effort. The month you mended the roof, the week you ate nothing but broth, the day the well nearly dried, the night your wife spoke your name again after 3 weeks of silence. These become your calendar. These become your memory. Dates mean little now. You count in costs. You get letters sometimes, not many. A cousin asking if you'll return east. A distant friend mentioning a job in the city. You read them once, then tuck them into the box beneath your bed. You never respond. Not because you have nothing to say, but because what you need to say wouldn't make sense to anyone who wasn't here. How do you explain that you stayed? Not because it made sense, but because you couldn't imagine not staying. You still walk the field at dusk. You still touch the soil. You still brush dust from the windowsill. Even when more settles a moment later. These things do not fix anything, but they feel like movement. And after all you've lost, movement feels close enough to meaning. You don't pray anymore. Not because you're angry, just because you're tired. You whispered prayers into the ground and the air and the sky, and none of them were returned. That doesn't mean there's no God. Just that if he's there, he's not taking questions. Or maybe he is, but he only answers in insects and wind and silence. Either way, you've stopped waiting for a reply. You don't think of yourself as a failure, but you've stopped using the word success. It feels dishonest. Success implies control, choice. But you had neither. You planted what you could. You saved what you could. You buried what couldn't be saved. You kept breathing. If that's not success, fine. Call it something else. Call it persistence. Call it residue. You walk through your home and see what's left. The patched roof, the thin blankets, the jars of pickled hope lining the cellar shelf. Everything you own has a bite taken out of it. Everything you carry has weight, and yet you carry it. You remember what the preacher said once long ago before it all began. The meek shall inherit the earth. You think about that now and find it strange because you're still here, and so is the earth. But what you inherited wasn't land. It was the knowledge that nature doesn't barter. It doesn't care how carefully you plant. It doesn't weigh your virtues. It doesn't check if you were good to your neighbors. It doesn't listen when you cry out. It swarms. It chews. It leaves. You didn't lose. You're still here breathing, walking, speaking when there's something to say. The house still stands. The children still sleep. The well still gives water. You didn't lose, but you didn't win. You endured. That's different. And if you learned anything, it's this. Insects don't negotiate, and the earth doesn't care how much hope you brought with you. That brings us to the end of tonight's slow unraveling. Not a tale of heroism or failure, but of what remains when survival leaves no one whole. If you're still with me, thank you for listening through the quiet horror of a world where endurance wasn't rewarded, only measured. If you'd like early access to future stories, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the description. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with other forgotten historical topics you'd like to see covered. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps others find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chronicler Andrew S. Sleep well.